Hello again. It's time for the Pick the Next Book I Read video. To recap, last week I read two books, which were Slayer, which is a Buffy the Vampire Slayer universe story, and December Park, which is a horror story, or Ronald Malfi story. And I had to pick between these four books. So before I tell you what books won, there were two books again this week that I decided to pick. Let's talk about the two books that I actually read this week. So we'll talk about Slayer and December Park. Now, let me talk about Slayer first. I was a big Buffy the Vampire Slayer fan. I loved watching the show when it was on. I was actually a big Joss Whedon fan. I even have like an autographed picture of Eliza Dushku somewhere in my house. I was a big fan of the show. And I actually even read the comic books that were after the show for a while. There's actually a new comic book out that I've been reading that's kind of resetting Buffy the Vampire Slayer in a whole new retelling that seems kind of interesting, and I'm looking forward to reading. But in general, I was a big fan of both Buffy the Vampire Slayer and the Angel series. So when I heard that they were doing an actual series, this is book one of a 3-book series, I was really excited. I've read other alternate Slayers in comic books. I've read about Frey and other different Slayers that people have talked about. So I had no qualms about having a book about different Slayers. And I really wanted to like this book. And I really did not like this book. For a person who is a fan of Buffy the Vampire Slayer, except for there were a few scenes in here where Buffy was in and one where Faith was in that was kind of interesting to read. The general book was so dull, I almost DNF'd the thing. I mean, I'm going to give this like a 2-star rating because I really did not like it. I will not continue the next books in this series. I was very depressed, to be honest with you, after I read this book. The thing about Buffy the Vampire Slayer, if you're a fan, at least for me as a fan, the greatest thing about that show was the personal interactions, the metaphor of high school as hell, and just seeing these character progression and the growth in these characters. And this just didn't have it. First off, let me give you kind of a brief synopsis here, is that there are basically twin sisters. There's a prophecy, and one sister is a Slayer, and the other one doesn't think she's going to be a Slayer, but she suddenly becomes a Slayer. The book takes place, I believe it's 2 to 3 years after the TV series ends, and it also uses the comic books, because if you're not aware, Dark Horse did, I believe it's 3 seasons now they did of Buffy the Vampire Slayer after it went off the air. So they have like a season 8, 9, 10 type of series. So this takes place after, I believe, like at least 2 seasons of the comic book. So some people could be confused. I mean, I haven't read the comic book in a while, to be honest with you. And even I was a little confused by the characters and some of the motivations as far as like what was going on. So I think it is kind of hard for a person who just read Buffy to jump into this, and I think that's kind of a disservice. Also, it deals with characters who are basically under kind of what is the remains of a Watcher Council, because the Watcher Council pretty much was kind of destroyed through Buffy, and through the first evil at the end of this season, and also through the comic books. The Watchers Council is pretty much decimated. And like I said, it deals with a prophecy, and it deals with this one girl who didn't think she was ever going to be a slayer, who devoted her life to being a healer and, working with the Watchers. So she becomes a slayer. And of course, there's a couple little backstabbing type of things going on, and little hidden agendas going on. But in general, I was just bored by this book. I was totally unimpressed with this book, and I'm just so sad to see what would have been a great book if they would have actually just had characters who had, a little bit of melodrama like Buffy had, or Angel had, or some kind of like a relation to anything that would be, a metaphor for life. But it just is just a really dull story in my mind. I couldn't even, the demons in here. It just, yeah, it's just not good. I mean, I don't know how else to describe it. It's just, for me anyway, even as a fan of Buffy the Vampire Slayer, I wouldn't recommend it. And if you are a fan of Buffy the Vampire Slayer, you may want to read the Dark Horse seasons before reading this to get a little bit up to date of, when they talk about certain people. The only interesting thing about this that it did cover was it covered Buffy's Watcher before she met Giles. So that was kind of interesting. Because that is actually the parent of one of the main character in this book, or was the character. And again, I don't think I need to discuss any more about why I didn't like this book. But yeah, Slayer, definitely not a book I can recommend. Next book, December Park, is better than Slayer. I can tell you. It's better than Slayer. I would probably give it a 3, maybe a 3.5, because it has some interesting stuff in it. But I think it's more of my expectations with this book that might have hurt me to a degree. If you don't know, December Park is about these kids that go missing, and there's a what they believe is a serial killer that they call the Pied Piper. Now, when I think of the Pied Piper, I definitely think of fantasy elements of kids being lured, into this, magical type of thing. And maybe that was, part of me thought that this would have some kind of supernatural element, but it didn't. It does follow kind of the It formula, as far as here's these, loser kids, the loser club of kids, they get picked on. There's one kid that's new. The kids actually, they see a body of this girl that they don't know, who's actually one of the victims of the Piper. And this new kid comes into the town, and he is obsessed with this killer, and he kind of like ropes all of the other kids into figuring out who the killer is, or catching the killer. And it becomes kind of like a Hardy Boys meets serial killer story. The problem I had with this book, besides the fact that it didn't have any supernatural elements, is even though like the It factor was there, as far as all these kids and their life, and being picked on, and there is a small romance in here as well, kind of had those tropes. There never was a feeling for me of a big impending danger throughout the book. So it really just kind of started dragging for a while, to the point where I was like, I just want to know who the killer is. And, when it did start getting a little bit more interesting, when we did start getting close to who the killer was, which is getting near the very end, there was a twist. And I honestly didn't think the twist was... It kind of came out of nowhere. There were hints, because they were like somewhat prophetic dream type things in here. That's about the closest thing to any kind of supernatural it had. But in general, I just was not impressed with the ending of the twist. I was not impressed with the way the pacing of this story was, and I was disappointed. I didn't think it was bad. I think as a murder mystery, serial killer book, it probably is a pretty good book. If I just went into this thinking it was murder mystery and not horror, maybe I would have given it a little bit higher grade. But in general, if you're a horror fan and you really just want a horror book, I wouldn't recommend December Park. I think it's definitely more in the mystery kind of thing. And there is no real clues for you to solve the mystery, so you kind of wind up just, being thrown at the end of who the person actually is, who's the killer. And they kind of set up a mystery with the new kid of why he is so obsessed. And that also is kind of a weak setup. I mean, they definitely had a really weird setup. Again, it was a little twist, a couple little twists at the end, but in general, like I said, it was an okay book for me, and nothing really to write home about. I was, again, disappointed, to be honest with you, about this book. 2 books down that I read for last week, and now we will see if the books that you chose for this week will let me down or not. So, for this week, there was Behind Her Eyes, The Collapsing Empire, Shadow of the Fox, and Bentley Little The Return. And all of these books actually did get votes. So it wasn't like last week where nobody got a vote. And it was definitely a neck and neck between The Return and Shadow of the Fox. Last I counted, I believe Shadow of the Fox was slightly ahead of The Return. But like last week, I decided I am going to read both of these books. And I am looking forward to them. I've actually already started listening to Shadow of the Fox on audio. And I have been reading Bentley Little The Return. And so far they seem really good. So I'm looking forward to continuing them. And so next week, you'll get my review of these 2 books. Now comes the choice of this week's books. So this week, I decided to pick up Vengeful. I have never read this book yet. I've read Vicious, and this book just sat there and just was never read. It is the sequel to Vicious, which is basically about 2 characters that wind up gaining superpowers, and it was a really good book. I really liked V.E. Schwab's Vicious, so I am looking forward to Vengeful. I've heard a lot of good things about it. I don't want to get too deep into it, but it's definitely a very interesting book by Victoria Schwab, and it is in more of her adult line as far as her book when she is called V.E. Schwab. That's more of her adult line, and then when she's Victoria Schwab, she's more of her YA line. So I also read the Darker Shade of Magic series. I love that as well. So I am looking forward to Vengeful by V.E. Schwab. So if you want me to read that, go down in the comment section and vote for that one. For my psychological thriller mystery type of book, I got Shari LaPena's Unwanted Guest. I don't know if I read The Couple Next Door. I think I did. It's been a while. But I know a lot of people like this author. I did read A Stranger in the House, definitely, and I did like it. So it had its problems when you thought about it, but all in all, it wasn't a bad book. So I would look forward to reading this. So again, if you want to know the story about this one, let's see. A weekend retreat at a cozy mountain lodge is supposed to be the perfect getaway. But when the storm hits, no one is getting away. It's winter in the Catskills, and Mitchell's Inn, nestled deep in the woods, is the perfect setting for a relaxed, maybe even romantic weekend away. It boasts spacious old rooms with huge wood-burning fireplaces, a well-stocked wine cellar, and opportunities for cross-country skiing, snowshoeing, or just curling up with a good murder mystery. So when the weather takes a turn for the worse and a blizzard cuts off electricity and all contact with the outside world, the guests settle in and try to make the best of it. Soon, though, one of the guests turns out dead. It looks like an accident. But when a second guest dies, they start to panic. Within the snowed-in paradise, something or someone is picking off the guests one by one, and there's nothing they can do but hunker down and hope they can survive the storm and one another. So this sounds really interesting. Definitely kind of like a "Hey, then they were none" type of story. So that is An Unwanted Guest by Shari LaPena. Again, if you're interested in me reading this, go down in the comment section and vote for it. My horror section for this week would be Jonathan Jantz's The Siren and the Specter. So this one is when David Kane, a celebrated skeptic of the supernatural, is invited by an old friend to spend a month in the most haunted house in Virginia. He believes the case will be like any other, but Alexander House is different. Built in the 1700s by a land baron to contain the madness and depravity of his eldest son, the house is plagued by the shadows of the past and the lingering taint of bloodshed. David is certain there will be a way to explain the supernatural occurrences and write a best-selling book about the experience. But David himself is haunted, as 22 years ago he turned away the woman he loved, and in despair she took her life. Now David is forced to look into his past as he begins to suspect she's following him to Alexander House. So again, sounds really interesting. That is The Siren and the Specter. And the last book I'm going to pick is obviously one of the YA selections. So that will be, it sounds like a Robin Hood retelling, which is called The Forest Queen. Let me tell you what this is about here. When 16-year-old Sylvie's brother John becomes a sheriff of Woodshire, she feels powerless to stop his abuse of the local commoners. And when John plots to marry her off, Sylvie fears she will never see her beloved home again. She runs away to the forest with her dearest friend, a handsome young huntsman named Bird, and soon a girl called Little Jane, a midwife named Maytuck, and a host of other villagers join them. Together they form their own community and fight to right the wrongs perpetuated by the king and his noblemen. But even Sylvie can't imagine the depths of depravity her brother is willing to sink into, until the terrible day she's forced to confront him. Can she overcome the evil in her own family in order to save the people of Woodshire, as well as a new family she's created for herself? Perfect for fans of fairy tale retellings, the smart, gorgeously written take on Robin Hood's tale goes beyond the original's focus on economic justice to explore love, gender roles, the healing power of nature, and what it means to be a family. So, sounds interesting. Definitely a female take on Robin Hood. So, I'm willing to give it a try. And again, if you're interested in me reading this book, please comment down in the comment section and let me know. So to recap, next week's choices are Vengeful by V.E. Schwab, An Unwanted Guest by Shari LaPena, The Siren and the Specter by Jonathan Jantz, and The Forest Queen by Betsy Cornwell. And I will see you next week with my reviews of The Return and Shadow of the Fox. And I will let you know who wins this poll for these 4 books. Again, thanks again for watching, and I hope to see you soon.